A feared Mafia boss is about to board his flight, but then a lost boy stops him in his tracks, and when he sees the mother, it's her, his past, his ex, standing right there. What happens next will change everything he thought he controlled. I wrote this story to bring you an authentic, gripping tale you won't want to miss until the very end. I'm Selena. Hope you're well. Make sure to subscribe and let's dive in. The hum of the airport felt like a distant vibration to Callus, a world he usually commanded with an almost instinctive precision. Yet today it seemed to blur into insignificance. Overhead, the automated boarding announcement rang through the terminal, crisp and unrelenting. But his gaze didn't follow the familiar hustle of travelers, their luggage wheels clattering like small drumbeats of a mundane life. Instead, something, or rather someone, had pulled his attention like a magnet that ignored all the iron of the world. Near the security checkpoint, a small boy sat on the polished floor, legs crossed, shoes entirely mismatched, one scuffed sneaker, the other a brown leather shoe, polished enough to suggest someone had tried, at least once, to keep him neat. His backpack was slung awkwardly over one shoulder, straps twisted as if he had thrown it on in a rush. The boy's tiny hands held a coin, spinning it with slow, deliberate motions, almost as if he were conducting some private orchestra, the world outside irrelevant. Callus's chest tightened. There was something about the child's stillness amid the chaos of the terminal that stopped time for a heartbeat. The way his eyes, dark and steady, held the motion of the world in place. It wasn't normal. It wasn't coincidence. A flash of something long buried surged through Callus, a memory buried under years of strategy, power, and necessity. He blinked, trying to convince himself it was a trick of light, a random moment, but the boy's gaze didn't waver. "If someone is late," the boy said suddenly, his voice clear, a tone that carried more observation than innocence, "do they forget on purpose?" The words were simple, almost childlike, yet they struck Callus like a hammer. He froze mid-step, the coin-spinning reflection mirrored in his narrowed eyes. His mind, always calculating, always searching for danger, immediately assessed every possibility. Was this some distraction? A setup? The boy's tone didn't demand an answer. It demanded recognition, understanding, acknowledgement. Callus' hand brushed against the side of his jacket, a subtle, instinctive movement to ensure his gun was secure, even though no immediate threat existed. "Some people say they're busy," Callus muttered, voice low, more to himself than to the boy, as if testing the reaction. The boy's head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but it carried the weight of judgment that adults never truly mastered. Callus's thoughts raced. He was trained to read people, to dissect every twitch, every shadow of intent, yet this child offered nothing to dissect. He simply existed, and that existence alone unsettled him. Before Callus could register more, a soft, tired voice floated across the distance, gentle yet threaded with authority and exhaustion. "Jack, honey, come here." The name hung in the air. Callus' body stiffened, his instincts clashing with the sudden surge of a memory he had thought suppressed. The voice was familiar, impossible to forget once heard, and it belonged to the woman who had once shared everything with him, yet whose presence now carried the cold inevitability of a world he had left behind. Marguerite. Her steps were measured, deliberate, graceful despite the weariness etched in her shoulders. Each step seemed to echo in slow motion for Callus, the terminal around them fading into a blur of distant travelers and announcements. His chest tightened, as if the air itself had thickened, and for a brief, impossible moment, he feared even breathing would betray him. The boy, Jack, glanced up at her, eyes widening, and something in that glance made Callus's gut twist. Recognition, yes, but also that quiet, almost imperceptible judgment that children seem to hold when they see the world clearly, without excuses. He was not just a child, He was a mirror reflecting every choice Callus had made, every absence he had justified with words like work and duty. Callus' mind flickered to the shadow behind her. He noticed it now, subtle, almost blending into the patterns of the terminal walls and glass. But he knew instinctively that it was deliberate. Someone was watching, someone who knew him, someone whose interest was not casual. That silent observer had the power to change everything in a heartbeat. His pulse quickened, not with fear exactly, but with recognition that his past, carefully compartmentalized, had just stepped into the present without warning. The boy spun his coin again, slower this time, as if sensing Callus's tension. He didn't speak, didn't ask for attention, yet his presence weighed heavier than any adult's confrontation could. The simplicity of a child asking a simple question felt like a challenge aimed at the very core of Callus's controlled existence. Marguerite stopped a few paces from Jack, her eyes scanning him for the briefest moment. Not fear, not anger, just assessment. The recognition was mutual, electric, yet wrapped in layers of restraint. Years apart had taught them both the cost of impulse. Callus wanted to step forward, to bridge the distance, to justify, to explain, but every instinct screamed caution. He had built a world on precision and shadows. One wrong move, one visible emotion, and the delicate balance could collapse. The shadow shifted slightly, subtle enough that most people would not notice, but to Callus it was a deliberate nudge, a signal that someone had arrived with intent, that someone was not here for coincidence. The terminal, bustling with hundreds, seemed suddenly constricted, claustrophobic. Time slowed, but only for him, as if the universe itself had paused to watch this collision of past and present. Jack's coin finally stopped spinning. He looked up at Callus, eyes steady, unreadable, yet somehow piercing. The boy didn't speak, didn't need to. His gaze alone posed questions Callus had avoided for years. Why were you absent? Where were you? Could you have done better? Could you have chosen differently? Margaret's hand reached for Jack's, and the small gesture, ordinary to anyone else, felt monumental to Callus. It marked the divide between the life he had lived and the life he had lost. Her fingers were gentle, protective, a line he could never cross without consequence. Callus' own hands twitched, wanting to intervene, wanting to reach out, but he remained frozen, every muscle in his body wired to the tension of the moment. Then a subtle motion from the shadow caught his eye, an almost imperceptible shift of weight, a tightening of fingers on a concealed object perhaps, a whisper of menace that confirmed his suspicion. Danger lingered here, unannounced, silent, waiting. It was an invisible thread connecting past mistakes with present vulnerability, and Callus felt the old adrenaline surge, a familiar reminder that power had always been currency, and awareness was survival. Margaret's gaze flicked to the shadow. Her expression didn't betray fear, only acknowledgement. She knew. Callus understood that she had never needed him to teach her about vigilance. She had always known, always been ready, even when he was not. The realization struck him with a cold clarity. The world he had once controlled could reach out and touch the people he cared about, even decades later, with lethal precision. For a moment, everything hung suspended. The boy, the woman, the shadow, the terminal, Callus himself. No words moved through the space, only the rhythm of distant announcements, luggage wheels, and the faint hum of air conditioning. The air felt thick, charged with potential energy, like the calm before a storm he knew was inevitable. Callus exhaled just slightly, enough to remind himself that he was alive, that he was here, that he could act. But what he could act upon remained unclear. The boy's eyes met his again, and in them was a quiet challenge, a statement of fact without judgment. You see what is, you know what has been lost. Marguerite called again, softer this time, a thread of patience woven through fatigue. "Jack, please, let's go." The boy rose slowly, deliberately, and for a fraction of a second, Callus' world contracted into a single point of observation. Every movement Jack made echoed with symbolism he was too old to ignore. The boy's innocence, his composure, his silent authority over his own small universe. It all reflected the absence, the choices, the power, and the regrets of Callus's life back at him. As mother and child began to move away, the shadow detached, gliding smoothly along the periphery of the terminal, following, studying, measuring. Callus's gut told him it was not mere surveillance. It was intent, and whatever lay ahead would not allow mistakes. Time seemed to resume its natural pace only reluctantly. Travelers moved, announcements repeated, the world continued. But for Callus, for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, life had stopped. The child, the woman, the shadow, they had frozen his world, rearranged it, and set in motion something unstoppable. And just as he took the first careful step forward, compelled by memory, recognition, and something he could not yet name, the boy looked over his shoulder and smiled faintly, knowingly, as if aware of more than Callus ever would be. In that smile lay the first question of a journey that had already begun. Callus realized the child and the mother were not just echoes of his past. They were the center of a storm he could neither predict nor control, and the shadow behind them was moving closer with intent that promised consequences far beyond the terminal walls. The moment after Jack and Marguerite began moving felt almost surreal to Callus. Each footstep they took was deliberate, measured, and calculated, an unspoken assertion of control over a world he had long ruled from shadows. The hum of the terminal, the distant rolling of luggage wheels, the chatter of oblivious travelers, all of it faded into insignificance. His eyes followed every movement, dissecting posture, timing, and intention. Even small details, the way Jack adjusted the strap of his backpack, the tilt of Marguerite's head, told him more about them than years of surveillance ever could. Marguerite's calmness was deceptive. Her body language, the subtle way she angled herself as she walked, reflected a constant awareness. Her steps created a protective perimeter around Jack, guiding him while maintaining an almost invisible barrier. Callus knew that she had lived years without him and survived perfectly. That realization hit him harder than any threat. She didn't need him. Not anymore. Jack's grip on his mother's hand was firm but gentle. His awareness was uncanny, his observations precise, and every glance he threw at Callus was loaded with silent recognition and questions Callus had no answers for. The boy's quiet confidence carried the weight of judgment, an unspoken understanding that absence had consequences beyond explanation. Callus felt a pang of helplessness, a rare sensation in a life defined by control. Ahead, the terminal stretched out in a labyrinth of polished floors and glass partitions, bustling with people who seemed unaware of the silent tension threading through the air. Marguerite guided Jack with subtle movements, sidestepping a group of travelers, adjusting the pace for safety, yet never allowing fear to show. Every gesture was fluid, natural yet precise, reflecting instincts honed over years of vigilance. Callous eyes flicked to the black-suited man lingering near a corner, phone in hand, posture taut but composed. He was observing, calculating, ready to intervene if necessary, but invisible to the casual observer. Callus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, an instinctive recognition of danger, a reminder that the world he thought he had mastered could reach out and strike through unseen channels. Jack's eyes flicked toward the man, subtle but deliberate. Even at such a young age, he seemed to sense threats that most adults overlooked. Callus realized that the boy's perception was not only sharp, but instinctive. The child moved through the terminal with an awareness that made every decision, every step, purposeful. He wasn't just being cautious. He was calculating potential outcomes, silently strategizing even in his innocence. Marguerite adjusted Jack's pace as they approached a sparsely crowded area near a row of benches. She whispered instructions that only he could hear, and Jack nodded, responding with precise movements. To anyone else, it would seem like a mother and child simply walking, but to Callus, it was a subtle choreography of survival, an unspoken communication honed by necessity. The black-suited man shifted slightly, his subtle motion catching Callus's attention. It wasn't aggression, not yet, but awareness and readiness, the hallmark of someone trained to exploit a lapse, to strike at opportunity. Callus recognized the silent threat immediately and knew that any misstep could trigger consequences far beyond a single encounter. Jack glanced back for the briefest moment, eyes locking with Callus's and conveying a depth of perception he could barely comprehend. It wasn't curiosity, it was assessment, evaluation, and an implicit question about his place in this suddenly fragile equilibrium. Callus felt the weight of that unspoken challenge, the pressure of recognition from someone too young to have experienced the complexity of his life, yet wise enough to reflect its consequences. Marguerite seated Jack briefly on the edge of a bench, positioning herself between him and potential danger, her movements subtle yet deliberate. Every micro-adjustment, a slight turn, a shift of weight, a protective hand gesture, was a testament to the vigilance she had mastered alone. Callus realized she had survived in the absence of his protection, in the harsh reality of a world where he had chosen power over connection. The man in black took a silent, calculated step closer, keeping his distance but narrowing the observational gap. Callus's instincts flared. This was not passive monitoring, it was positioning, predatory patience. Every subtle angle of his body, every tilt of the head indicated he was mapping the space, anticipating movements, calculating reactions. Jack's attention shifted subtly to the black-suited figure, a fleeting glance that seemed almost instinctive. His movements were precise, controlled, a balance of awareness and calm restraint. The child's gaze, measured and unflinching, reflected an understanding of danger that Callus found unsettling. He realized, with a mix of awe and unease, that Jack had already internalized lessons that many adults failed to grasp even after years of experience. Marguerite's posture remained fluid, poised, yet every inch of her body conveyed readiness. She whispered to Jack again, adjusting his position, guiding his line of sight, reinforcing safety through subtle movement rather than words. Callus could feel the old frustration rise within him. He wanted to intervene, to assert control. But any action now risked exposing vulnerabilities they all relied upon to navigate this precarious moment. The terminal buzzed around them, rolling suitcases, distant announcements, travelers moving with casual oblivion. But within this microcosm, time seemed stretched, each second weighted with anticipation. Every glance, every step, every pause carried potential significance. Callus's mind raced, assessing angles, possibilities, outcomes. Danger was present, precise and invisible, threading through the air like a silent current. Jack shifted again, this time adjusting a small coin in his pocket, a ritualized gesture that seemed almost symbolic. His movements were deliberate, yet natural, a rhythm that both focused him and revealed his awareness. Callus watched with mounting tension, understanding that even such small gestures were deliberate parts of an internal map of threat and survival. Marguerite whispered once more, her voice low, precise yet calm. Jack responded with a subtle nod, their coordination almost imperceptible to anyone else. Callus felt the tension coiling tighter. The synergy between mother and child was quiet, controlled, but radiated an unspoken warning to anyone observing: do not underestimate them. The black-suited man moved closer still, just enough to shadow their path without drawing overt attention. Callus's pulse accelerated, instinct sharp as he tracked the predator's approach. The subtle choreography of positioning, observation, and anticipation had transformed the terminal into a tense stage where one misstep could trigger catastrophe. Jack looked toward the shadow again, brief but telling, a flicker of recognition that suggested comprehension far beyond his years. Marguerite adjusted his stance, ensuring his small body remained protected, while keeping him engaged, aware, and poised. Callus recognized the unspoken strength in their coordination, a silent assertion that they could navigate danger without panic, without error. The air between Callus and the black-suited man seemed charged, an invisible wire connecting predator, observer, and target. Every subtle motion, the shift of a shoulder, a tilt of the head, a deliberate pause, spoke of calculations beyond words. Callus understood that this was a test, a setup, a silent measurement of patience, awareness, and reaction. Jack's gaze flicked to Callus again, deliberate, assessing. Callus felt exposed, not physically, but emotionally, a rare vulnerability in a life defined by intimidation and control. The child's presence alone demanded reflection, accountability, and humility, all without uttering a single word. Marguerite adjusted her position, ensuring Jack remained behind her protective line. Her composure never wavered, yet Callus noted the subtle tension in her muscles, the micro-adjustments that conveyed awareness, readiness, and vigilance. She was prepared for confrontation but avoided provoking it. Every action deliberate, every movement calculated. The black-suited man shifted his stance, silent and deliberate, narrowing the distance just enough to observe patterns without drawing attention. Callus's mind raced through scenarios, consequences, and contingencies. The tension thickened, charged with anticipation, each heartbeat amplified in significance. Jack adjusted his backpack strap subtly, a gesture of awareness and preparation, an acknowledgement of potential danger. His movements were precise, controlled, and deliberate, a silent statement of observation and readiness. Callus realized that the boy's awareness exceeded expectation, projecting quiet authority over the space despite his youth. Marguerite whispered once more, guiding Jack's attention, reinforcing vigilance without breaking composure. Every motion spoke volumes, every glance had intent. Callus observed, restrained, aware that any attempt to intervene prematurely could unravel the delicate balance they had maintained. The black-suited man moved closer still, adjusting angles and distance, a predator testing perception and reaction. Callus' pulse quickened. This was not passive observation, but silent preparation for action. The threat was immediate, precise, and invisible to all except those attuned to it. Jack's gaze, brief and sharp, flicked toward the approaching figure. He assessed, calculated, and returned focus to his mother, aware of threat, distance, and timing. Callus watched, caught between admiration, concern, and a growing awareness that he was no longer in full control. Marguerite's posture shifted again, protective and calculated, aligning Jack to minimize exposure. Every movement reinforced safety, coordination, and vigilance. Callus felt a surge of helplessness tempered with recognition. He had lost influence here, and the mother-child pair had gained a quiet mastery over circumstance. The black-suited man's approach slowed, calculated, measuring, waiting for reaction. Callus recognized the intent, the precision, the potential for disruption. Every second stretched, waited with anticipation. Jack adjusted his stance, positioning himself subtly, alert but composed. Marguerite remained fluid, protective and aware, guiding him without disrupting flow. The tension thickened as predator, observer, and mother-child converged in a delicate balance of awareness. A single misstep, a single glance, could unravel it all. Callus felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The shadow was moving closer, the threat becoming imminent. As Marguerite guided Jack around a structural column, the black-suited man finally made his decisive shift, closing the distance with lethal intent. Callus realized that the encounter they had navigated so far was only the prelude, and the storm waiting beyond the terminal walls was about to break. 3. The echo of the black-suited man's approach still lingered in Callus's senses, like a warning unspoken but undeniable. Every fiber of his being screamed that the balance in the terminal had shifted, that the prelude of tension was giving way to a confrontation whose consequences would extend far beyond a single encounter. Yet, as he observed Marguerite and Jack navigating the crowd with calm precision, Callus' mind involuntarily slid back to a night long buried, a night that had defined the very distance he now struggled to bridge. Years earlier, the choices had been clear, or so he had believed. Power had always been tangible, measurable: influence, fear, territory, money, connection, love, truth. These were abstract, fleeting, easily sacrificed in the pursuit of control. He had been 30, ambitious, relentless, and convinced that any vulnerability could be exploited. Marguerite had been steady, patient, but the inevitability of his ambition had outpaced her trust. She had packed deliberately, suitcase wheels clicking rhythmically against the hallway's floor, each reverberation louder than any argument he had offered to keep her. "I'm not taking anything from you," she had whispered in the dim light of the apartment they shared, her voice barely audible yet carrying the weight of inevitability. The phrase had been gentle, almost pleading, but Callus had been deaf to nuance. He had left without resistance, blind to intention, blind to the subtle act of defiance that marked the first step in a life she would build without him. The emptiness that followed had seemed insignificant against the tide of deals, threats, and power plays that consumed him. That same night, the world he had carved from shadows had demanded attention. A rival, aggressive, cunning, and ruthless, had appeared at his doorstep, threatening the empire he had spent years constructing. Choices had to be made: power over love, influence over connection. He had chosen to respond to the tangible, measurable threat, the one that could dismantle everything he had built. Marguerite's absence had been a collateral casualty, and he had justified it with strategy, with necessity, with the cold logic that had always shielded him from human reflection. Now, years later, standing across the terminal, observing her effortless composure, the faint tightening of her jaw, the subtle movements that protected Jack, Callus understood what he had abandoned. Absence had hardened him. Yes, but more than that, it had stripped him of perspective. Power had replaced presence. Decisions once made in the pursuit of empire had echoed through the years, leaving voids where relationships should have existed. The terminal, bustling yet indifferent, reflected the sterile clarity of consequences, unavoidable, permanent, and undeniable. Jack tugged slightly at Marguerite's hand, drawing her just a step closer, and Callus noticed the boy's quiet awareness, the subtle scanning of the terminal, the careful observation of the black-suited man, the micro-adjustments in posture that mirrored instinct and training. Every movement was deliberate, yet it carried the innocence of youth, juxtaposed with a wisdom no child should possess. Callus felt the pull of regret tighten in his chest, heavier now that he could observe their skill without having guided it. The shadow in the corner shifted, barely perceptible, a subtle adjustment that betrayed recognition. Someone from his past had spotted him, understood the context, and acknowledged the presence of a man whose influence had once been absolute. The air between him and the shadow thickened, electric with unspoken threats, layered intentions, and silent calculations. Callus recognized the familiar rhythm of danger, the kind that had defined his life for decades, the kind that required vigilance, patience, and precision in equal measure. Marguerite's eyes flicked toward the corner, her awareness instantaneous, but her composure did not falter. She had learned to navigate threats silently, to observe without provoking, to respond without hesitation. Every micro-gesture, a shift of weight, the adjustment of Jack's hand on her arm, the protective angle of her body, spoke of a mastery over tension he had once thought exclusive to himself. Callus felt the sharp pang of realization. She had survived, thrived even, in the absence of his intervention. Jack's small face turned toward him, eyes piercing yet unreadable. He did not speak, but the message was clear. The presence of danger was understood, acknowledged, and prepared for. Callus' own instincts surged in response, but he remained frozen, constrained by the need to observe, to calculate, to wait. One wrong move could collapse the fragile equilibrium Marguerite and Jack had created, and he knew he could not intervene without consequence. The memories of that night, of Marguerite packing, of the rivals' threats, of the cold decision to leave, weighed heavier now. Callus remembered the way the city had whispered his name, how fear had moved at his command, how loyalty and obedience had bent beneath the weight of influence. But he also remembered the echoing emptiness of the apartment once she left, the silence that replaced laughter, the absence of warmth where ambition had reigned. The contrast between past power and present reflection was stark, nearly suffocating. Marguerite shifted slightly, her body language fluid yet deliberate, guiding Jack around a cluster of travelers who remained oblivious to the tension threading the space. Callus noted every subtle movement, the turn of her head, the angle of her shoulders, the protective placement of her hand. Each was deliberate, measured, and effective, a choreography of survival she had mastered on her own. The black-suited man continued to observe, his calculated presence a reminder that the terminal, this public arena, was layered with danger, invisible to the untrained eye. Callus' pulse quickened, every instinct alert, yet restrained. The man was not overt in his threat, but his positioning, attention, and anticipation were unmistakable. Every shift in the shadows, every movement of light across polished floors carried weight in Callus's mind. Jack's gaze flicked briefly toward the black-suited man, subtle and deliberate. The child's comprehension of threat was startling, a skill honed naturally, without instruction, without fear, yet precise. Callus felt an unfamiliar humility in recognition. The boy was alert, observant, and ready in a way that mirrored his own instincts decades earlier. Marguerite whispered to Jack, guiding his attention, coordinating without distraction, and Callus noticed the precision, the absolute synchronization between mother and child, an unspoken dialogue of awareness. Each step they took was deliberate, safe, and calculated, yet maintained the fluid grace of natural movement. The shadow adjusted again, narrowing the gap, scanning the terminal, evaluating the space. Callus recognized the silent tension, the anticipation of reaction, the measured patience. One misstep, one sudden movement could initiate confrontation. Yet Marguerite's calm composure, Jack's subtle awareness, and the structured motion of their approach created a fragile yet undeniable counterbalance. Callus' mind drifted back to the night when he had chosen empire over intimacy. He remembered the precise moment of decision, turning away from Marguerite's pleading eyes, leaving the weight of her presence behind, choosing a world of control and fear over warmth and vulnerability. Every calculation had been rational, strategic, necessary, but the cost had become painfully evident now in the subtle ways she moved, the unspoken language of protection, the quiet strength of a life he had abandoned. Jack adjusted his posture, shifting weight slightly, prepared to move at a moment's notice. Callus observed the boy's small body and felt the enormity of responsibility, the silent reflection of consequences, the clarity that presence and absence left marks impossible to erase. Marguerite glanced at the terminals, exits, scanning routes, angles, and potential obstacles. Her subtle assessments, imperceptible to the untrained observer, were precise and necessary. Callus felt the weight of his absence even here, the knowledge that she had learned survival without him, mastering instinct over instruction, the black-suited man's approach grew more deliberate, his presence folding into the environment while remaining unmistakably dangerous. Callus felt the surge of adrenaline, the thrill of recognition, and the creeping realization that this encounter was far from simple. The shadowed figure had noticed him too, aware that the past had intersected with the present. Jack's eyes flicked toward Callus again, unblinking, assessing, and in that brief glance lay understanding, judgment, and expectation. Callus felt the pressure of accountability without a word being exchanged. The child's observation was silent, yet absolute. Marguerite adjusted Jack's grip on her hand, subtly repositioning him as she guided him through the crowd. Every step reflected experience, instinct, and coordination. Callus watched, restrained, aware that any attempt to act prematurely could disrupt their carefully maintained balance. The shadow shifted, drawing slightly closer, invisible to most, but Callus noted the intent. Patience, awareness, and silent measurement characterized every motion. The potential for chaos was imminent. Callus's chest tightened as the weight of the past collided with the present. Decisions made years ago had cast ripples he could never reclaim. Yet here, across polished floors, observing a mother and child navigating danger, he confronted the stark reality of absence, choice, and consequence. Jack's subtle glance over his shoulder, Marguerite's poised movements, the black-suited man's calculated approach, all converged to create a tense equilibrium. Every breath, every motion, every shadow carried potential meaning, potential threat. Marguerite's whisper to Jack prompted him to shift, to follow a precise path, to remain vigilant. Callus noticed the choreography, the silent coordination, the mastery of awareness that had grown in his absence. The shadow adjusted one final time, a predator closing in with patience, honed over experience. Callus's pulse surged. He knew that this was the tipping point, the moment where observation would give way to action, where past decisions and present danger collided. Jack's gaze met Callus's briefly, unflinching, unyielding, yet reflective of comprehension beyond his years. Callus realized that this child's presence was not only a mirror of absence, but a catalyst for reckoning he had long delayed. Marguerite positioned Jack behind her, protective, vigilant, composed, and Callus felt a surge of helplessness and awe. She had mastered what he had abandoned: awareness, instinct, resilience, without instruction, without guidance, and perhaps without regret. The terminal felt charged with tension, every sound amplified, every movement significant, every shadow threatening. Callus knew with certainty that nothing here was accidental, nothing left to chance. And then, as they navigated toward a corner of the terminal, the black-suited man made a subtle, deliberate step forward, closing the distance with intent unmistakable to Callus's trained eyes. Callus realized with cold clarity that the storm he had once orchestrated in darkness was now converging upon him in the open, and the fragile balance of observation, awareness, and survival was about to shatter. 4. The terminal's polished floors reflected the sharp angles of fluorescent light, stretching the shadows of travelers into long, distorted silhouettes. Callus watched every movement of Marguerite and Jack with a keen, trained eye, noting the smallest adjustments in posture, the subtle rhythm of their pace, the silent coordination between mother and child. Jack bent slightly, his small hands reaching carefully to tie his shoes, the precision almost surgical, his focus unwavering despite the chaos of the crowded terminal. Callus' pulse quickened. This boy moved with awareness beyond his years, a quiet reflection of the resilience Marguerite carried in every line of her posture. Marguerite adjusted Jack's backpack straps with a single fluid motion, her hands steady and controlled. Years of struggle were etched into her shoulders, into the tension of her spine, into the careful modulation of her breathing. Her gaze swept the terminal constantly, scanning exits, potential obstructions, and the flow of the crowd without appearing rushed or anxious. Callis's chest tightened at the realization. She had learned to survive without him. The thought was almost unbearable, yet undeniable. The black-suited man lingered near a corner, his presence subtle yet unmistakable. Callis felt the familiar stir of tension, the prickle of adrenaline as instinct told him that the man was calculating, measuring, ready to intervene at a fraction of a misstep. He had seen the type countless times. In the shadows of his empire, operatives trained to observe, infiltrate, and exploit hesitation. Yet here, in the open, the man's precision was almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to Callis' trained perception, it radiated imminent threat. Jack's eyes, dark and observant, met Callis's for a fleeting moment. There was curiosity there, yes, but also evaluation, an unspoken question that probed far deeper than mere recognition. Callis understood instantly that the boy's awareness was intuitive. It was the result of observing Marguerite, of navigating a world that demanded vigilance, of sensing danger that adults often ignored. The realization pierced him with a mix of awe and regret. This child, shaped by absence, had grown capable in ways Callis had never anticipated and never guided. Marguerite's movements were graceful, yet purposeful. She guided Jack around clusters of travelers with micro-adjustments in pace and positioning, each motion reflecting instincts honed over years of navigating unpredictability. Callis noted the subtle signs of strategy, the slight tilt of her head to gauge angles, the gentle shift of weight to block potential interference, the positioning of her hand to provide guidance without overprotection. Every action was a lesson in silent leadership, and every detail magnified the chasm left by his absence. The shadow of the black-suited man extended and contracted as he moved, a silent predator threading through the terminal. Callis calculated trajectories, noting the way light hit reflective surfaces, the potential blind spots, the timing of crowd movements. He recognized the pattern immediately. The man was testing them, not with confrontation, but with silent pressure. Each deliberate step, each careful observation, was a probe designed to provoke a reaction. Callis's instincts sharpened. Jack's gaze flicked toward the man, a brief but precise scan. It was as if he measured the distance, noted posture, and predicted intent in a single, fluid instant. Callis swallowed the rising tension. He had faced threats before, but the calculated perception of a child, sharp, measured, and unflinching, was disarming in a way he hadn't expected. Marguerite whispered a single word, almost imperceptible, and Jack responded instantly with a subtle adjustment in stance. The coordination was silent yet effective, demonstrating a depth of understanding built on necessity rather than instruction. Callis could not help but observe the interplay, recognizing that each movement conveyed protection, awareness, and authority, all without verbal communication. The terminal seemed to pulse with tension, as if the very air recognized the precarious equilibrium. Travelers moved past, oblivious, their conversations a low hum, but the microcosm surrounding Marguerite, Jack, and the black-suited man was charged with anticipation. Every footstep, every glance, every breath carried significance beyond the ordinary. Callis' perception, once honed on influence and fear, now parsed subtle cues of survival, human connection, and instinctive coordination. Jack adjusted his hand on the strap of his backpack, tiny fingers curling just enough to signal readiness without drawing attention. Marguerite subtly shifted her stance to shield him, her movements fluid and silent, almost invisible in execution. Callis realized that the lessons she imparted had been absorbed in the most primal way, through observation, adaptation, and necessity. The child's competence was a reflection not only of instruction, but also of inherited awareness, honed by circumstance and absence. The black-suited man advanced slightly, adjusting his angle to maintain oversight. Callis's muscles tensed, not in aggression, but in recognition of the potential consequences. Every detail mattered: the timing of steps, the tilt of the head, the arc of movement through the open space. One miscalculation, even the smallest hesitation, could unravel the delicate balance that Marguerite and Jack had maintained. Jack's gaze met Callus's again, a quiet interrogation that required no words. Callus felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing down: the absence, the consequences, the acknowledgement that the past was irreversible. The boy's presence alone demanded reflection, accountability, and humility. Callus recognized, perhaps for the first time in years, that observation could teach as powerfully as action. Marguerite adjusted Jack's position subtly as they navigated past a row of empty benches, shielding him from sightlines he hadn't even considered. Every micro-adjustment, every measured pace spoke of experience, strategy, and resilience born of necessity. Callus's own movements, once defined by power and control, now felt secondary, an outsider to the quiet mastery they displayed. The black-suited man's shadow shifted along the terminal floor, narrowing the margin for error, his approach deliberate but unseen by all except those attuned to tension. Callus's instincts flared. He analyzed angles, exits, crowd flows, and potential interventions, knowing that any sudden motion could escalate into danger. Yet he restrained himself, observing, calculating, waiting for the precise moment to act if needed. Jack subtly adjusted his posture once more, a minor shift that signaled readiness without overt motion. Marguerite's hand brushed lightly against his back, a gesture of guidance, assurance, and protection. Callus noted the synchronization, mother and child moving as one, instinctively and efficiently navigating threat, distance, and observation. The coordination was silent, but absolute. The tension thickened as Callus assessed the black-suited man's proximity. He recognized a familiar signature in the predator's approach: patience, calculation, and anticipation. The subtle narrowing of angles, the minor adjustments in stride, the poised stillness, all indicated readiness to exploit hesitation. Callus's awareness sharpened to the point where every sound, every light reflection, every minor shift in air currents became data. Jack's gaze returned to Callus for a final, fleeting second, the depth of perception in his young eyes striking. He was alert, evaluative, and composed, a mirror of Marguerite's resilience and foresight. Callus realized the boy was not merely observing. He was judging, learning, testing, and preparing. Marguerite moved forward with silent grace, guiding Jack around a cluster of oblivious travelers. Every gesture, every weight shift, every glance carried intent. Callus understood now that survival in absence required mastery of observation, anticipation, and control. Marguerite had acquired these lessons naturally. Jack had absorbed them intuitively. The black-suited man's step forward was deliberate, measured, and precise. Callus noted the subtle acceleration, the silent testing of spatial awareness, the preparation for engagement. The energy in the terminal seemed to tighten, stretching seconds into tangible pressure. Every observer, though unaware, was caught in the unspoken web of anticipation. Jack's hand shifted minutely, adjusting the balance of his weight, a subtle indicator of awareness. Marguerite's posture mirrored this, creating a fluid, protective buffer. Callus felt an almost painful humility, the realization that their competence had grown in his absence, that control could exist without him. The terminal's light reflected off polished surfaces, exaggerating shadows, amplifying tension. Callus felt a rush of clarity. Everything here, the child's awareness, the mother's coordination, the black-suited man's intent, was a lesson in silent negotiation, in reading and respecting unspoken signals. The distance between him and the black-suited man contracted imperceptibly. Callus knew the approaching threat was deliberate, testing limits, measuring reactions. He felt the old adrenaline, sharpened by experience, tempered now by humility and observation rather than immediate action. Jack glanced back again, fleetingly, locking eyes with Callus, conveying both understanding and expectation. The child's gaze was a mirror reflecting absence, consequence, and potential reconciliation. Marguerite guided Jack around a small partition, subtly shielding him from the line of sight of the approaching figure. The fluidity of their movement spoke of survival, foresight, and instinct. Callus realized every lesson he had ignored in the past had been internalized here. Without him, they had adapted, survived, and mastered. The black-suited man finally broke his silent positioning, stepping with a precision that indicated the situation was approaching a climax. Callus's pulse surged. The calculated tension, the anticipation, the unspoken threats, all had reached a critical point. Jack's posture remained poised, Marguerite's movements seamless, the terminal alive with silent anticipation. Callus felt the gravity of absence, the sharp reminder that time lost could never be reclaimed. As Marguerite guided Jack behind a structural beam, the black-suited man's shadow detached from the corner, moving decisively toward them. Callus realized that the lessons of silence and observation were about to collide with confrontation, and the fragile equilibrium they had maintained was now on the brink of collapse. The black-suited man's deliberate approach had shifted the atmosphere into something electric, charged with silent threat, yet Callus did not act immediately. His instincts screamed that a wrong move could trigger chaos, that any attempt to step forward without strategy might expose Marguerite and Jack, who had learned to navigate danger with instinct and subtlety he had long abandoned. He studied the precise arc of the man's movement, the careful measurement of distance and timing, and noted how the shadow of authority radiated with a quiet menace that demanded respect. Marguerite, always poised, finally glanced toward Callus, her expression neutral, yet piercing. She inclined her head slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement, almost casual but layered with history and silent understanding. It was a thank you, one of many unspoken ones, but couched in a distance that reminded Callus of the years lost. Her eyes were steady, controlled, holding him accountable without words, and yet suggesting that recognition, however measured, was still present. Jack, standing beside her, broke the weighty silence. "You're the uncle who stayed," he said plainly, deliberately, with a tone sharper than any accusation. The statement carried the blunt clarity only a child could deliver, a mirror of judgment, observation, and truth unfiltered by diplomacy. Callus felt the sudden weight of those words, the sting of realization. In that moment, the child's awareness of absence and presence collided with decades of choices Callus had made, forcing him to reckon with consequences that could no longer be ignored. Callus opened his mouth to respond, to explain, to justify the years of distance and decisions that had seemed necessary at the time. But the black-suited man's presence restrained him. The gaze of a predator, poised, measured, and trained to exploit hesitation, held him rooted. Callus understood that speaking prematurely could unravel the delicate balance that Marguerite and Jack had maintained, and the thought of endangering them, especially Jack, kept him silent, no matter how fiercely he wanted to justify himself. The distant hum of boarding announcements reached his ears, but the call for movement seemed irrelevant. Travelers shuffled and adjusted, unaware that in one corner of the terminal, a delicate confrontation had frozen time. Marguerite's control over space, Jack's calculated awareness, and the black-suited man's silent menace formed an invisible triangle of tension, each movement carefully measured, each breath deliberate. Callus watched the rhythm, noting how even the smallest gestures, Jack's subtle shift of weight, Marguerite's protective stance, the predator's calculated steps, carried weight far beyond their size. Jack, curious but disciplined, reached for Callus's hand, an almost instinctive test of connection and trust. Callus bent slightly, his fingers brushing the boy's small hand, sensing the hesitation, the rules ingrained far too early in a child forced to understand danger. Before he could react further, Jack withdrew, obeying the unspoken protocols he had learned through necessity. It was a minor gesture, yet profoundly revealing, a combination of caution, assessment, and inherent understanding that reflected the environment Marguerite had taught him to navigate. Marguerite's eyes, meanwhile, never wavered. She measured Callus with calm precision, scanning the arc of his body, the tension in his posture, and the subtleties of his gaze. Every glance, every micro-expression carried information. She was aware of the world he had once dominated, the dangerous undercurrents that he had tried to escape, and the intersecting threads that now connected him, involuntarily, to the fragile unit she had created in his absence. Callus felt the weight of observation, not judgment, not accusation, but an acknowledgement that required honesty, accountability, and measured restraint. He looked at Jack again, noticing how strongly the boy reflected Marguerite in miniature, the defiance in his posture, the clarity in his eyes, the precise movements that demonstrated intelligence beyond years. Callus recognized traits he had admired in Marguerite but never nurtured in himself, an innate strength that had been inherited, internalized, and honed through survival. There was no softness here, no unguarded innocence. Jack's awareness was sharpened, intentional, and impossible to underestimate. The black-suited man, sensing the subtle energy between the three, moved deliberately closer, threading the space with intent that could be felt but not named. Callus' instincts flared. He recognized the pattern of testing, probing and pressuring before initiating disruption. It was the type of approach he had used countless times, now reflected back at him through the precision of a professional who understood timing, perception, and human behavior. Every step forward carried a latent threat, every tilt of the head a quiet assessment, and Callus understood that the equilibrium was fragile. Marguerite shifted slightly, repositioning Jack behind her, maintaining a protective buffer. She did not speak, yet her posture conveyed the subtle imperatives of safety, readiness, and command. Callus noted the fluidity of her movements. Each motion was protective without overbearing, instructive without verbal communication, strategic without aggression. The elegance of survival honed in absence had become a language he no longer fully commanded. Jack's eyes flicked between Callus and the shadowy figure, registering threat, evaluating intent, and confirming understanding without uttering a word. Callus felt exposed in ways he had long avoided, vulnerable not to force, not to danger, but to perception, judgment, and silent truth. The boy's awareness acted as a mirror, reflecting the absence, the lost time, and the consequences of decisions he had taken decades before. The shadow shifted again, moving closer with the precision of a trained predator, each step deliberate yet imperceptible to the casual observer. Callus's pulse surged. The silent tension tightened as the triangle of movement converged. The predator's proximity was measured, a test of reaction and composure, and Callus recognized the stakes. One miscalculation could shatter the fragile control Marguerite and Jack had maintained. Marguerite's gaze remained fixed, scanning, calculating, protective, and assertive. Her subtle movements were a choreography of observation, a shift of weight, a slight rotation of shoulders, the guiding placement of Jack's hand. Every gesture conveyed information, instruction, and command. Callus understood viscerally that her mastery of this micro-world had been forged entirely without him. Jack, sensitive to shifts in the environment, adjusted his stance minutely, a movement almost imperceptible yet significant. Callus noted the boy's instinctive ability to read space, to detect threat, and to modulate his presence. It was a quiet brilliance, the product of observation, resilience, and the subtle inheritance of Marguerite's poise. The terminal's ambient noises, rolling luggage, distant announcements, snippets of conversation, faded in significance. Callus's perception filtered through tension, awareness, and reflection. Every sound became a marker, every shadow a potential vector of change, every micro-gesture a signal demanding interpretation. The black-suited man's presence condensed, reducing psychological space, increasing pressure, and signaling intent. Callus's mind raced, calculating paths, predicting behavior, and weighing consequences. He remained restrained, conscious that any direct movement could destabilize the delicate equilibrium. Jack's glance toward him was sharp, evaluative, yet patient. Callus felt the weight of expectation, the reflection of absence, and the understanding that presence alone was insufficient to bridge the years lost. The boy's composure was a challenge, a test, and an acknowledgement all at once. Marguerite subtly shifted, angling herself to shield Jack while maintaining observation. Callus recognized the duality of protection and strategy in her movements: care without weakness, vigilance without panic, composure without compromise. He felt the bitter truth of what his absence had allowed her to cultivate, skills he could not replicate in the moment, mastery earned through independence and necessity. Jack's subtle postural adjustments and micro-expressions reflected comprehension, patience, and anticipation. Callus observed, silently calculating, yet internally acknowledging that control no longer belonged solely to him. The child and mother commanded their environment with instinctive elegance, their unity a reflection of survival and resilience. The black-suited man moved again, imperceptibly yet with precise intent, closing the subtle gap between predator and observed. Callus' pulse tightened further. The energy in the space became almost palpable. The silent confrontation had reached a point where action, hesitation, or misinterpretation could tip the balance irreversibly. Marguerite whispered a single word, subtle and inaudible, prompting Jack to adjust, reposition, and remain protected. Callus watched the synchronization, the unspoken dialogue of awareness, and felt the immense weight of years lost, decisions taken, and consequences deferred. Jack's eyes, dark and alert, flicked between Callus, Marguerite, and the approaching figure. Callus realized with a cold clarity that the child's understanding of danger, timing, and intent mirrored the very skills he had relied upon for decades, skills now honed naturally rather than taught. Marguerite guided Jack past a structural pillar, positioning him strategically behind her. Callus noted the fluidity and precision, the culmination of instinct, practice, and protective intent. The black-suited man's steps, calibrated and deliberate, began to close the spatial gap with inevitability. Callus' thoughts raced, but restraint dictated silence. Any sudden movement could provoke an outcome they were not prepared to navigate. He felt the pressure of absence, accountability, and recognition converge into a single tense awareness. The boy's subtle glance, Marguerite's controlled posture, the predator's deliberate movement, everything converged in the terminal, stretching moments into an elongated pause, where tension replaced time itself. As the black-suited man's shadow finally detached completely from the corner, stepping decisively into the path between Callus and the mother-child pair, Callus realized that the confrontation he had feared was inevitable, and the fragile balance they had maintained for years was about to fracture in a single, critical moment. The black-suited man had finally closed the subtle distance, yet remained poised, observing, calculating, as if the entire terminal were a chessboard and he had already anticipated every possible move. Callus's instincts flared, muscles coiled, but his mind remained painfully aware that any overt reaction could destabilize Marguerite and Jack. Every step, every micro-gesture, every breath seemed amplified. The tension was no longer just physical, it was psychological, emotional, moral. Every unspoken word between the three of them weighed more than any spoken argument ever could. Margaret's voice broke through, calm, precise, and cutting, yet tempered with quiet authority. Jack grew strong not because of him, she said, her eyes locking on Callus's, but in spite of him. The words were soft, measured, but the sting was undeniable. Callus felt an immediate constriction in his chest, a suffocating weight of truth. Years lost, choices made, opportunities abandoned, they crystallized in that sentence. Words lodged in his throat, refusing to surface, inadequate to repair what absence had irreparably shaped. Jack, standing beside her, tilted his head slightly, his eyes dark, perceptive, unblinking. He asked, innocently yet piercingly, "Do you always take up all the space?" The question, simple on the surface, carried a weight far beyond its syllables. Callus froze. The words encapsulated decades of neglect, absence, and dominance, not just in power, but in emotional presence. He could not answer. He realized with unbearable clarity that absence had been his constant companion, guiding him more than any deliberate choice ever could. The terminal around them seemed to pause, the distant chatter of travelers fading into irrelevance. Silence thickened, almost tangible, settling heavier than any confession Callus had ever uttered. It was the kind of silence that forced reflection, demanded accountability, and highlighted the chasm between intent and consequence. Every footstep, every glance, every shifting shadow became a marker, a reminder of what was lost and what might never be reclaimed. Margaret's gaze flicked briefly to the black-suited man, sharp and precise, a silent warning encoded in a look. Some lessons were not taught through conversation, she seemed to say. They were taught through danger, through vigilance, through observation and consequence. Callus recognized the reality immediately. He could not protect them entirely, could not intervene without risk, and had arrived too late to rewrite the past. Every step now carried scrutiny, every gesture was analyzed, and every motion had potential repercussions he could neither predict nor control. Jack's posture reflected awareness. He shifted slightly behind Marguerite, a micro-adjustment that indicated understanding, vigilance, and readiness. Callus observed the boy and felt the full weight of his absence. The child had internalized strategy, caution, and resilience without instruction, molded instead by necessity and circumstance. Callus' mind raced with the realization that presence alone, unaccompanied by guidance or emotional connection, was insufficient to bridge years lost. The black-suited man's shadow fell across the polished terminal floor, sharp, deliberate, controlled. Every subtle adjustment of his stance, every tilt of the head, every micro-step was measured to provoke reaction, to assess composure, to test boundaries. Callus noted the precision. The predator's approach reflected decades of experience in psychological manipulation and calculated threat. The world he thought he had left behind was not just present. It was active, observing, waiting for imperfection to exploit. Marguerite shifted again, guiding Jack behind her, adjusting their positioning to block potential lines of observation. The fluidity of her movements was astonishing, protective without overbearing, subtle without missing detail. Callus watched in silence, painfully aware that she had cultivated these skills entirely independently, without his intervention, without his influence. Every motion told a story of survival, experience, and learned instinct that he had failed to instill. Jack's eyes flicked toward Callus once more, a mixture of evaluation and cautious curiosity. The boy's awareness was sharp, calculated, and instinctive, reflecting not just maternal guidance, but inherited perception. Callus recognized the mirror, traits he had admired in Marguerite, now expressed fully and unapologetically in their child, a silent judgment of absence and accountability. The terminal's air seemed thick, charged with anticipation. Travelers moved around them, oblivious to the tension threading the space. but Callus felt it in every pore. The silent potential for escalation, the proximity of danger, the fragile balance that could shatter with a single misstep. Every glance between him, Marguerite, and Jack carried consequence. Every shadow became a threat or a signal, every reflection a subtle indicator of the next action. Marguerite's gaze met Callus, steady, unwavering, yet layered with meaning. It conveyed recognition without indulgence, acknowledgement without forgiveness. She had survived, thrived even, in his absence. She had guided Jack, trained instinctively for danger, and preserved safety and autonomy, all without him. The realization was humbling and painful, a confrontation not just with external threat, but with himself. Callus took an imperceptible step forward, cautious, calculating, yet restrained by the knowledge that his interference could destabilize their carefully maintained rhythm. The black-suited man shifted slightly in response, and Callus felt the old adrenaline, sharp and immediate, spike. Yet this time, the rush was tempered by reflection, an awareness that presence without comprehension, without timing, without respect for earned skill, could be catastrophic. Jack adjusted his stance minutely, one foot forward, one hand resting lightly on Marguerite's arm. It was a small movement, but loaded with meaning, readiness, observation, assessment. Callus saw it clearly and felt the piercing truth of what he had lost. Not just years, but influence, guidance, presence, the ability to shape rather than observe. The black-suited man's eyes narrowed, scanning Callus in a measured assessment. He was probing for weakness, hesitation, the subtle micro-signals that revealed character and capability. Callus felt the pressure of every second, every breath, every blink. He understood that inaction was itself a choice, one laden with risk and consequence. Marguerite whispered softly to Jack, a single word, a guiding prompt, and Jack responded without hesitation. Callus observed the synchronization and felt the sting of inadequacy. He had abandoned opportunities to teach, to guide, to influence. They had learned to survive without him, thriving in his absence, sharpening instincts he could no longer provide. The terminal's polished floors reflected shadows of travelers, of the black-suited man, of Marguerite and Jack, creating a visual layering of tension that seemed almost symbolic. Callus recognized it as a reminder. His world, built on observation, fear, and control, now intersected with consequences of absence and the formidable competence of those he had abandoned. Jack's gaze locked briefly with Callus's, silent and unwavering. The boy's eyes were observant, evaluative, piercing, and unflinching, a reflection of truth that demanded acknowledgement. Callus felt the pressure of judgment, not just from Marguerite, not just from circumstance, but from innocence forced to adapt to absence and danger. Marguerite subtly shifted again, adjusting Jack's position behind her, maintaining a protective line. Every micro-motion was calculated: distance, angle, shielding, observation. Callus realized that her skill had developed organically in his absence, forged from necessity, awareness, and resilience he could no longer claim to provide. The black-suited man's shadow adjusted again, closing the psychological gap, testing patience, measuring reaction, anticipating motion. Callus's senses sharpened. He felt the latent threat in every movement, every reflection, every subtle shift in the terminal's crowded environment. Jack subtly mirrored his mother's movements, shifting his weight, angling his posture, prepared to react if required. Callus recognized the inherited reflexes, the silent training, the intuitive readiness. It was a stark reminder that presence without guidance had created competence in absence, and that absence itself could shape in ways he had never foreseen. Marguerite's eyes flicked once more to the black-suited man, a silent warning. Danger remained imminent, unspoken, yet clear. Lessons continued through threat rather than dialogue. Callus understood. He could no longer rewrite the past. He could only observe, adapt, and hope his presence did not exacerbate the tension. Every gesture, every movement now carried weight. Callus's every step was analyzed by predator and child alike. Every breath he drew, every glance he cast, was part of an unspoken calculus he could neither fully influence nor control. He had arrived too late to teach, to guide, or to intervene. The silence of the terminal was oppressive, laden with reflection, judgment, anticipation. Callus's chest tightened with the realization that some truths are delivered not through words, but through presence, absence, and consequence. Jack's gaze lingered on him a fraction longer, a quiet challenge, a subtle expectation. Callus recognized it as a mirror of his own failures, a test of intention, a reflection of lost opportunities. Marguerite guided Jack carefully, positioning him where both could monitor the black-suited man while remaining safe. Callus noticed every micro detail: shoulder shifts, weight distribution, peripheral awareness. The child and mother's coordination was absolute, silent, and precise. A lesson in human resilience that required no intervention. The black-suited man finally made a subtle move toward them, signaling the next phase of this tense, silent confrontation. Callus's pulse surged, every instinct alive but tempered by reflection and restraint. As Marguerite positioned Jack behind a pillar, subtly shielding him while maintaining full awareness, the black-suited man's movement became decisive, signaling that the true confrontation, one that would test every lesson of absence, presence, and consequence, was about to ignite. Callus realized the moment had arrived where survival, regret, and truth would collide in a way that could not be undone. The black-suited man's final approach slowed, measured, calculated, and yet Callus did not react with aggression. Years of experience had taught him the difference between control and confrontation, but in that moment he understood the futility of power when it clashed with consequence, absence, and human resilience. Every step he took away from the trio felt both heavy and liberating, a strange liberation tempered by regret. The terminal's polished floor reflected shadows of 3 figures moving with precision, yet their movements told stories of distance, absence, and survival, none of which Callus could change. Callus turned toward the nearest airline counter and booked another flight, carefully ensuring departure time gave him distance but kept him within observation. There was no urgency, no need to flee, only the knowledge that leaving on this schedule allowed him to maintain presence without interference. Yet even in his calculated choice, he felt the tug of years lost, the memory of decisions made long before he understood what absence truly meant. Every choice had been deliberate, but the weight of the consequences pressed against him now with an undeniable force. He took a deliberate step back into the flow of the terminal, keeping eyes fixed on Marguerite and Jack. Every micro-expression they shared was amplified in his awareness. The slight tilt of her head, the measured step Jack took, the way she guided him without overt command. Callus understood that what he was witnessing was not just reunion, but resilience, survival, and a quiet mastery he had failed to instill, but could observe. He remained silent, knowing that words would only fracture the careful balance they had maintained. Marguerite caught his gaze once, and there was no warmth, no invitation. Only a measured warning that effort should never be mistaken for promise. Her tone was steady, watchful, precise. Callus felt the sting of that truth more acutely than any physical threat. He knew she had built a world without him, where absence had been met with competence, care, and vigilance. The warning lingered, a reminder that redemption, if it existed, would never come in gestures alone. Jack approached cautiously, small but deliberate, carrying a toy plane in his hands. He extended it toward Callus with no smile, no hesitation, no emotion beyond neutral assessment. It was not an offering of affection. It was a challenge, a test, a gauge of presence. Callus took the plane in his hand and felt its weight, both literal and symbolic. The gesture carried meaning beyond play. It measured trust, potential, and belonging in a world that had continued without him. The child's eyes, calm yet piercing, dared him to prove he could fit into a life he had long abandoned. Callus studied the boy, noting subtle echoes of Marguerite's posture and poise. Jack's gaze, steady and perceptive, revealed the years of observation, the resilience honed by absence, and the intelligence cultivated through vigilance. Callus understood that this child was a reflection not just of her mother, but of all he had missed. Lessons unshared, moments unseen, consequences endured. The realization hit him with an almost physical ache. Presence alone could not rewrite the past. Some things could only be witnessed. The black-suited man's presence lingered, a subtle but unmistakable threat, signaling that Callus' world of control, influence, and shadows had never truly disappeared. The predator had maintained distance until the precise moment, proving once again that vigilance and consequence are unrelenting. Callus' own instincts were alive, watching for interference, yet the encounter demanded restraint rather than reaction. He'd arrived too late to teach, too late to change, and perhaps too late to claim any measure of authority over the situation. Marguerite adjusted Jack slightly, positioning him so that even the smallest angle of observation offered safety while maintaining a sense of control. Her movements were fluid, precise, and instinctive, a choreography of protection and awareness he could only watch in awe. Callus recognized the mastery she had achieved in his absence, a silent curriculum built on necessity, vigilance, and intuition. Every gesture she made conveyed authority, care, and experience. He could do nothing but witness, absorbing the painful elegance of survival without interference. The terminal's fluorescent lights reflected across polished floors and windows, catching the shadows of passengers passing unaware. Yet within that mundane crowd, an invisible tension persisted. The collision of past mistakes, the consequences of absence, and the silent negotiation between survival, threat, and reconciliation. Callus moved slowly, deliberately maintaining distance, conscious that any abrupt gesture could disturb the fragile equilibrium. Jack handed him the toy plane again, this time with a subtle tilt of the wrist, signaling neutral assessment but heightened awareness. Callus took it, feeling the weight of what it represented, an opportunity observed but not guaranteed, a moment measured, a bridge unbuilt yet symbolically extended. The gesture was both an invitation and a warning, a test of presence, intent, and respect. Marguerite's gaze did not soften. She remained composed, vigilant, and precise. Her voice, when it came, was measured, quiet, commanding, a reminder that presence does not equal permission, and effort is not always promise. Callus felt the truth of that in his bones. He understood, in a way that would linger long after this encounter, that some reconciliations are observed rather than claimed, and some bridges exist only as possibilities, not guarantees. The black-suited man's shadow moved closer, now fully aligned with Callus's line of sight, yet he remained silent. The threat was palpable, subtle, and calculated. It was a reminder that the world he had tried to escape never truly slept, that power, danger, and vigilance followed him across borders, terminals, and relationships. Every careful step he took away from the family he longed to reconnect with was monitored, tested, and evaluated. Callus exhaled slowly, deliberately, as he began to walk toward the exit, each step calculated to maintain observation without interference. He understood the limits of his presence. He could witness, he could observe, but he could not rewrite years, nor could he protect entirely without risking destabilization. The fragility of the moment was a lesson in itself. Some reunions demand only witness, and some consequences cannot be erased by action alone. Jack's gaze lingered on him as he passed, the boy's expression unflinching yet reflective. Margaret's posture remained protective, her eyes sharp, scanning both the black-suited man and the movements of Callus as he withdrew. Every gesture, every pause, every subtle shift carried meaning. Callus understood the depth of observation he had abandoned for decades, and he felt the weight of both presence and absence simultaneously. The terminal's ambient sounds, rolling luggage, distant conversations, announcements, faded in importance. The entire space seemed suspended in tension, each movement deliberate, each interaction measured. Callus noted every shadow, every reflection, every angle of observation, but understood that his role here was no longer dominion. It was witness. He reached the large glass doors leading to the jet bridge, pausing for a final glance. Marguerite and Jack remained composed, aligned, vigilant, and in control. Callus's eyes swept over the subtle details, the tilt of Jack's head, the protective positioning of Marguerite's arm, the way they moved as a coordinated unit. He recognized, painfully and beautifully, that life had continued without him, that competence, awareness, and survival had been cultivated in his absence. The black-suited man followed at a distance, silent, measured, a reminder that the world never forgives gaps in vigilance. Callus felt the familiar tingle of awareness, the reminder that control, influence, and danger coexist, and that absence may have lessons heavier than presence. He walked past the automated boarding gates, intentionally leaving the terminal without drawing attention. Every step was deliberate, conscious of observation, restraint, and consequence. The engines of the waiting planes roared in the distance, symbolizing movement, departure, and transition. Callus realized that some endings do not heal. They linger in memory, in tension, in the echoes of what was lost and cannot be reclaimed. Jack handed him the toy plane one last time, neutral, assessing, almost daring. Callus accepted it with a measured nod, understanding that the gesture required no response, no words, only acknowledgement. It was a bridge of possibility, not a guarantee, a reflection of presence without promise. Marguerite's eyes followed him as he passed through the crowd, her posture steady, watchful, and precise. There was no forgiveness, no invitation, only measured awareness, a warning that effort should not be mistaken for entitlement. Callus felt the weight of that clarity pressing against him, mingling with regret, relief, and lingering hope. The black-suited man shadowed him subtly, a reminder that his world, the one built on influence, observation, and consequence, had not ceased in his absence. Danger remained present, silent, patient. Callus understood that while some battles are fought in action, others are endured in reflection. He finally reached the waiting area of his new flight, pausing at the window to watch engines ignite and planes lift. The terminal receded behind him, yet the images of Marguerite and Jack remained vivid. Their resilience, coordination, and awareness had been forged without him, and yet he had witnessed it all. He understood that some reunions demand only the humility of observation, the restraint of presence, and the patience to respect outcomes he could no longer control. Callus exhaled, letting the last vestiges of tension settle into his bones. The weight of absence, regret, and unfinished business was undeniable, but so was the clarity. He could not reclaim the past, but he could bear witness, learn, and perhaps, in quiet reflection, seek redemption not through action but through understanding. As the engines roared and the planes lifted into the evening sky, Callus held the small toy plane in his hand, realizing that some endings never heal completely. They linger in memory, shadowed by danger, regret, and the unchangeable weight of lost time, leaving only the knowledge that some reunions exist to show what was lost, not to restore it. Some reunions don't heal. They leave shadows, questions, and the weight of what was lost. If this story gripped you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a tale that will pull you in, twist your heart, and keep you on the edge until the very last word. I'm Selena, and I'll see you in the next story. Let's keep diving into the real, the raw, and the unforgettable.